Yo, what's going on guys, Jin here. This is my updated Ball Lightning build for endgame content. It can handle the tormented bosses, the pits up to tier 100, and still works really well for endgame even if you don't have any Ubers. If you like this kind of video, please like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell as it helps out the channel a lot. Now let's get to the build. So starting with the skill tree, we're going to take 2 into Firebolt. We're going to come down here to our core skills, and we're going to take 1 into Charged Bolts, and go for Destructive Charged Bolts. We're also going to take 1 into Devastation, and 3 into Elemental Dominance. We come down to our defensive skills. We're going to take 1 into Teleport, and go for Shimmering Teleport. 1 into Ice Armor, and go for Shimmering Ice Armor. We're also going to take 1 into Elemental Attunement, and 3 into Glass Cannon. We come down here to our Conjuration skills, taking 1 into Ice Blades, going for Summoned Ice Blades. We're also going to take 3 into Conjuration Mastery, 1 into Align the Elements, 3 into Mana Shield, and 3 into Protection. In our Mastery skills, we're taking 1 into Inner Flames, and 3 into Devouring Blaze, 5 into Ball Lightning of course, going for the Wizard's Ball Lightning, 1 into Static Discharge, 3 into Invigorating Conduit. Down in our ultimate skills, we're going to take 1 into Permafrost to get the 3 into Hoarfrost. We're going to take 1 into Unstable Currents, and then Prime Unstable Currents. We'll also take 1 into Coursing Currents, and 3 into Electrocution. As for our key passive, we're going to take Veer's Mastery. So it's a pretty straightforward skill tree. If you want, you can take the points out of Hoarfrost and the point out of Permafrost to put them into Lightning Spear, going for Invoked Lightning Spear, and the extra point into Flame Shield. You would do this if you don't have a Harlequin Crest, as it will help your clear because the Lightning Spear will be able to stun your enemies, and also you need the point in Flame Shield. So next up we have the Paragon Board. So for the Paragon Board, our starting board's going to have the Elementalist Glyph. That's going to allow us to deal fire, cold or lightning damage to an enemy in order to increase our damage dealt to them by 5% for 10 seconds, and that will stack once per element. We're also going to get the bonus to Paragon nodes within range. For our second board, we're going for the Enchantment Master board, and we're going to put in the Reinforced Glyph here. So that's going to give us 15% damage reduction while we have an active barrier. And that's also going to give us bonus to all rare nodes within range. For our third board, we're going to go for the Burning Instinct board. And our glyph is going to be Tactician. That's going to allow us to deal 10% increased damage for 4 seconds after casting a defensive skill. And this duration is increased by 4 seconds for each defensive skill not on our action bar. We're also going to get 125% bonus to all rare nodes within range. For our fourth board, we're getting the Frigid Fate board, making sure we take the legendary node here. And we're going to put in the Adept Glyph for that mastery damage. For our fifth board, we're going to the right, taking the Ceaseless Conduit board. We're going to put in the Destruction Glyph here for that critical strike damage. Also, critical strikes will increase all damage the enemy takes from us by 2% for 10 seconds, up to 12%. Then we come down for our sixth board, the Searing Heat board. And we're going to put in the Exploit Glyph here for that vulnerable damage. Also, dealing damage to vulnerable enemies increases our damage by 1% for 6 seconds, up to 10%. For our seventh board, we're going to go for the Static Surge board. And our glyph is going to be the Flame Feeder glyph. That's going to give us damage to burning enemies. Also, we deal 10% increased direct damage to burning enemies. And lastly, for our 8th board, to the left of the Frigid Fate board, it's going to be the Elemental Summoner board. And we're going to put the charge glyph in here for the crackling energy damage, but more importantly, picking up crackling energy will grant us 5% increased damage for 5 seconds, and that will stack up to 15%. So that pretty much wraps up the Paragon board, nice and simple. If I went too fast for you, don't forget all of this will be in the description below, as well as the gear, and the skills, and the enchantments, etc. Next up, we have the enchantments. So for our enchantments, we're going to take Ice Blades for our first slot. For every 40 seconds in cooldowns we spend, we spawn an Ice Blades on a random enemy. We also get the modifiers, of course. And for our second enchantment, we're going to use the Firebolt enchantment. So direct damage from skills applies up to an additional 30% burning damage over 8 seconds. And this is how we proc our Devouring Blaze passive, and also our Flame Feeder glyph. Next up, we have the gear. So for the gear, on the left I'll list the affixes and tempering you want, and let's start with the Helm. So we're going to use a Harlequin crest here, and that's going to give us all stats, max life, resource generation, and cooldown reduction. Also, we gain 20% damage reduction in addition to gaining 4 ranks in all of our skills. So we're going to try and masterwork the cooldown reduction on this if possible, and I know this is a hard helm to get, so if you don't happen to have one of these, you could use a Godslayer crown. That also has an awesome unique aspect, and you would also masterwork the cooldown reduction on this. If you don't have access to a Godslayer crown either, you would use a helm with mana per second, intelligence, and cooldown reduction, and you would also want to masterwork the cooldown reduction. And you would want to temper that with max life and lucky hit % chance to freeze. For the aspect, you would use Everliving. That's going to allow you to take 10 to 25% less damage from crowd controlled or vulnerable enemies. Next up, we have the Chestpiece. We're going to use a Raiment of the Infinite here. That's going to give some intelligence, damage to close, damage to stunned, and ranks into glass cannon. Also, after using teleport, close enemies are pulled to us and stunned for 2 to 3 seconds, but teleport's cooldown is increased by 20%. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the damage to close enemies here. If you don't have access to a Raiment, you would use a Chestpiece with intelligence, max life, and mana per second, and you would want to temper that with max life and lucky hit % chance to slow. As for the aspect, you would want to use the aspect of concentration. That's going to allow your conjuration skills to grant you 15 to 25% damage reduction for 5 seconds. As for the masterworking on the normal Chestpiece, you would go for the intelligence. Next up, we have the gloves. We're just going to use some normal gloves here, and we want to get attack speed, core skills, and crit chance. If you can't get those, then intelligence is good as well. As for the tempering, you would temper the close damage, and you want lucky hit % chance to immobilize if possible. As for the masterworking, you're going to try and get the masterworking on the core skills. And for the aspect, we're using Gravitational here, so ball lightning will orbit around you, and deals 10 to 25% increased damage. Next up we have the legs. We're going for Tibault's Will. That gives you some potion capacity, max resource, damage %, and damage reduction from close. You also deal 10 to 20% increased damage while unstoppable and for 5 seconds after, and when you become unstoppable, you gain 50 of your primary resource. So for Tibault's, you would want to masterwork the damage reduction from close if possible. If you don't have access to Tibault's, you would use legs with intelligence, max life, and armor. You would want to temper that with max life, and lucky hit % chance to stun. As for the aspect, you would use Veer's Mastery. So the key passive of Veer's Mastery also grants you 6 to 9% damage reduction, tripled while fighting a close enemy. And for the masterworking, you would want to masterwork the intelligence. Next up we have the boots. We're going to use normal boots here with ball lightning ranks, armor, and mana per second. As for the tempering, you would temper the teleport cooldown reduction, and immobilize duration. As for the masterworking, you want to try and get that on the ranks into ball lightning. For the aspect, we're using concussive strikes here, so you have the lucky hit. Damaging an enemy has up to 20% chance to daze them for 2 seconds, and you deal 5 to 20% increased damage to dazed enemies. Pretty straightforward here. Also, if you can get boots with attacks reduce evade cooldown, go for those as well. Next up we have the main hand. We're going to look for a dagger, and we want to get a dagger with intelligence, vulnerable, and crit damage. As for the tempering, we're going for a chance to cast ball lightning twice, and damage to close enemies. As for the masterworking, you're going to try and masterwork the chance for ball lightning projectiles to cast twice. For the aspect, we can use accelerating, so crit strikes with our core skills, increase our attack speed by 10 to 25% for 5 seconds. For the offhand, we're going to use something with intelligence, critical strike chance, and cooldown reduction. For the tempering, we want the same as the main hand, the chance for ball lightning to cast twice, and damage to close enemies. As for the masterworking, we're going to try and masterwork the chance for ball lightning projectiles to cast twice. Cooldown reduction would be a secondary choice. As for the aspect, we're going to use the Conceited aspect here, so we'll deal 10 to 25% increased damage while we have a barrier active. Next up we have the Amulet. For the Amulet we'll be looking for something with Conjuration Mastery, cooldown reduction, and attack speed, and we want to temper that with Unstable Currents cooldown reduction and damage to close enemies. For the masterworking here, we're going to go for the Conjuration Mastery. And as for the aspect, we're going to be using Storm Swell here, so we will deal 23 to 45% increased damage to vulnerable enemies while we have a barrier. Next up we have the rings. We're going to be using the Rasha's Iridescent Loop as our first ring. That will give us non-physical damage, lucky hit chance, resource gen, and cooldown reduction. But also, for each type of elemental damage we deal, we gain 10 to 15% increased damage for 4 seconds, and that will be up to 40 to 60%. And dealing any elemental damage will refresh all of these bonuses. So with Rasha's Iridescent Loop, we want to masterwork the cooldown reduction if possible. For our secondary ring, we're using an uber unique, the Ring of Starless Skies. That's going to give us crit strike chance, crit strike damage, core damage, and lucky hit chance. But more importantly, the unique aspect is really strong for this build. Spending your primary resource reduces the resource cost of your skills and increases your damage by 10% for 3 seconds up to 50%. So your abilities will cost 50% less at 5 stacks, and also deal the extra 50% multiplicative damage. For the masterworking on this ring, we would masterwork the core damage. If you don't have access to either the Rasha's Iridescent Loop or the Ring of Starless Skies, then you would want to use a ring with critical strike chance, attack speed, and resource cost reduction, and you would temper both rings with Unstable Currents cooldown reduction and damage to close enemies. And for the masterworking, you would want to masterwork the attack speed. As for the aspects, on the first ring, you would want to put the Prodigy's aspect on, using a cooldown restores 10 to 25 mana. And if you don't have either of the rings, then for the second ring, you would want to put on the aspect of control. So that will let you deal 20 to 35% more damage to immobilize, stunned, or frozen enemies. Another option here would be the aspect of Shredding Blades. So your Ice Blade's chance to apply vulnerable is increased by 20%, and the vulnerable duration will be increased by 4 seconds. You'll also gain 15 to 30% vulnerable damage multiplicative. So that pretty much wraps it up for the gear. For the gems, in the jewellery, we're going to put our skulls for the armour. In the weapons and offhand, we're putting in the blue gems, sapphires, for the vulnerable damage. And in our armour, we're going to use the red gems for our maximum life, the rubies. That pretty much wraps up this build. I hope you enjoyed the video. If you learned something from it, or if you just made it this far, please leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell, as it helps out the channel a lot. For now, I will leave you with some ball lightning action, and I hope to see you in the next video. Thanks again. Bye!